Chapter 16. North and South. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This reading by Lucy Burgoyne. North and South by Elizabeth Cleghorn Gaskell. Chapter 16. The Shadow of Death. Trust in that veiled hand, which leads none by the path that he would go, and always be for change prepared, for the world's law is ebb and flow. From the Arabic. The next afternoon Dr. Donaldson came to pay his first visit to Mrs. Hale. The mystery that Margaret hoped their late habits of intimacy had broken through was resumed. She was excluded from the room while Dixon was admitted. Margaret was not a ready lover, but where she loved passionately, and with no small degree of jealousy. She went into her mother's bedroom, just behind the drawing-room, and paced it up and down, while awaiting the doctor's coming out. Every now and then she stopped to listen. She fancied she heard a moan. She clenched her hands tight, and held her breath. She was sure she heard a moan. Then all was still for a few minutes more, and then there was the moving of chairs, the raised voices, all the little disturbances of leave-taking. When she heard the door open, she went quickly out of the bedroom. "My father is from home, Dr. Donaldson. He has to attend a pupil at this hour. May I trouble you to come into his room downstairs?" She saw and triumphed over all the obstacles which Dixon threw in her way, assuming her rightful position as daughter of the house in something of the spirit of their elder brother, which quelled the old servant's officiousness very effectually. Margaret's conscious assumption of this unusual dignity of demeanour towards Dixon gave her an instant's amusement in the midst of her anxiety. She knew, from the surprised expression on Dixon's face, how ridiculously grand she herself must be looking, and the idea carried her downstairs into the room. It gave her that length of oblivion from the keen sharpness of recollection of the actual business in hand. Now, that came back, and seemed to take away her breath. It was a moment or two before she could utter a word. But she spoke with an air of command, as she asked: "What is the matter with mamma? You will oblige me by telling the simple truth." Then, seeing a slight hesitation on the doctor's part, she added: "I am the only child she has here. I mean, my father is not sufficiently alarmed, I fear, and therefore, if there is any serious apprehension, it must be broken to him gently. I can do this. I can nurse my mother. Pray, speak, sir. To see your face, and not be able to read it, gives me a worse dread than I trust any words of yours will justify." "My dear young lady, your mother seems to have a most attentive and efficient servant, who is more like her friend." "I am her daughter, sir." "But when I tell you she expressly desired that you might not be told." "I am not good or patient enough to submit to the prohibition. Besides, I am sure you are too wise, too experienced to have promised to keep the secret." "Well," said he, half smiling, though sadly enough, "there you are right. I did not promise. In fact, I fear the secret will be known soon enough without my revealing it." He paused. Margaret went very white, and compressed her lips a little more. Otherwise not a feature moved. With the quick insight into character, without which no medical man can rise to the eminence of Dr. Donaldson, He saw that she would exact the full truth, that she would know if one iota was withheld, and that the withholding would be more torture, more acute than the knowledge of it. He spoke two short sentences in a low voice, watching her all the time, for the pupils of her eyes dilated into a black horror and the whiteness of her complexion became livid. He ceased speaking. He waited for that look to go off, for her gasping breath to come. Then she said: "I thank you most truly, sir, for your confidence. That dread has haunted me for many weeks. It is a true, real agony. My poor, poor mother!" Her lips began to quiver, and he let her have the relief of tears, sure of her power of self-control to check them. A few tears, those were all she shed, before she recollected the many questions she longed to ask. "Will there be much suffering?" He shook his head. "That we cannot tell. It depends on constitution, on 1,000 things. But the late discoveries of medical science have given us large power of alleviation." "My father," said Margaret, trembling all over. "I do not know Mr. Hale. I mean, it is difficult to give advice. But I should say, bear on, with the knowledge you have forced me to give you so abruptly, till the fact which I could not withhold has become in some degree familiar to you, so that you may, without too great an effort, be able to give what comfort you can to your father. Before then, my visits, which, of course, I shall repeat from time to time, although I fear I can do nothing but alleviate, 1,000 little circumstances will have occurred to awaken his alarm, to deepen it, so that he will be all the better prepared." "Nay, my dear young lady." "Nay, my dear, I saw Mr. Thornton, and I honour your father for the sacrifice he has made, however mistaken I may believe him to be. Well, this once, if it will please you, my dear. Only remember, when I come again, I come as a friend, and you must learn to look upon me as such, because seeing each other, getting to know each other at such times as these, is worth years of morning calls." Margaret could not speak for crying, but she wrung his hand at parting. "That's what I call a fine girl," thought Dr. Donaldson, when he was seated in his carriage, and had time to examine his ringed hand, which had slightly suffered from her pressure. "Who would have thought that little hand could have given such a squeeze? But the bones were well put together, and that gives immense power. What a queen she is, with her head thrown back at first to force me into speaking the truth, and then bent so eagerly forward to listen. Poor thing! I must see she does not overstrain herself, though it's astonishing how much those thoroughbred creatures can do and suffer." The girl's game to the backbone. Another, who had gone that deadly colour, could never have come round without either fainting or hysterics. But she wouldn't do either, not she, and the very force of her will brought her round. Such a girl as that would win my heart, if I were 30 years younger. It's too late now. Ay, here we are at the Arches." So out he jumped, with thought, wisdom, experience, sympathy, and ready to attend to the calls made upon them by this family, just as if there were none other in the world. Meanwhile, Margaret had returned into her father's study for a moment, to recover strength before going upstairs into her mother's presence. "Oh, my God, my God! But this is terrible! How shall I bear it? Such a deadly disease! No hope! Oh, mamma, mamma, I wish I had never gone to Aunt Shaw's, and been all those precious years away from you. Poor mamma! How much she must have borne! Oh, I pray thee, my God, that her sufferings may not be too acute, too dreadful. How shall I bear to see them? How can I bear papa's agony? He must not be told yet, not all at once. It would kill him. But I won't lose another moment of my dear, precious mother." She ran upstairs. Dixon was not in the room. Mrs. Hale lay back in an easy chair, with a soft white shawl wrapped around her, and a becoming cap put on, in expectation of the doctor's visit. Her face had a little faint colour in it, and the very exhaustion after the examination gave it a peaceful look. Margaret was surprised to see her look so calm. "Why, Margaret, how strange you look! What is the matter?" And then, as the idea stole into her mind of what was indeed the real state of the case, she added, as if a little displeased, "You have not been seeing Dr. Donaldson, and asking him any questions, have you, child?" Margaret did not reply, only looked wistfully towards her. Mrs. Hale became more displeased. "He would not, surely, break his word to me, and—" "Oh yes, mamma, he did. I made him. It was I, blame me." She knelt down by her mother's side, and caught her hand. She would not let it go, though Mrs. Hale tried to pull it away. She kept kissing it, and the hot tears she shed bathed it. "Margaret, it was very wrong of you. You knew I did not wish you to know." But, as if tired with the contest, she left her hand in Margaret's clasp, and by she returned the pressure faintly, that encouraged Margaret to speak. "Oh, mamma, let me be your nurse. I will learn anything Dixon can teach me. But you know I am your child, and I do think I have a right to do everything for you." "You don't know what you are asking," said Mrs. Hale, with a shudder. "Yes, I do. I know a great deal more than you are aware of. Let me be your nurse. Let me try, at any rate. No one has shall ever try so hard as I will. It will be such a comfort, mamma." "My poor child." "Well, you shall try. Do you know, Margaret, Dixon and I thought you would quite shrink from me if you knew." "Dixon thought," said Margaret, her lip curling. "Dixon could not give me credit for enough true love, for as much as herself. She thought, I suppose, that I was one of those poor sickly women who like to lie on rose leaves, and be fanned all day. Don't let Dixon's fancies come any more between you and me, mamma. Don't, please," implored she. "Don't be angry with Dixon," said Mrs. Hale, anxiously. Margaret recovered herself. "No, I won't. I will try and be humble, and learn her ways, if you will only let me do all I can for you. Let me be in the first place, mother. I am greedy of that. I used to fancy you would forget me while I was away at Aunt Shaw's, and cry myself to sleep at nights with that notion in my head. And I used to think, how will Margaret bear our makeshift poverty after the thorough comfort and luxury in Harley Street, till I have many a time been more ashamed of your seeing our contrivances at Helstone than of any stranger finding them out." "Oh, mamma, and I did so enjoy them. They were so much more amusing than all the jog-trot Harley Street ways. The wardrobe shelf with handles, that served as a supper tray on grand occasions, and the old tea chests stuffed and covered for ottomans. I think what you call the makeshift contrivances at dear Helstone were a charming part of the life there. "I shall never see Helstone again, Margaret," said Mrs. Hale, the tears welling up into her eyes. Margaret could not reply. Mrs. Hale went on. "While I was there, I was for ever wanting to leave it. Every place seemed pleasanter, and now I shall die far away from it. I am rightly punished." "You must not talk so," said Margaret impatiently. "He said you might live for years. Oh, mother, we will have you back at Helstone yet." "No, never. That I must take as a just penance." "But, Margaret, Frederick—" At the mention of that one word, she suddenly cried out loud, as in some sharp agony. It seemed as if the thought of him upset all her composure, destroyed the calm, overcame the exhaustion. Wild passionate cry succeeded to cry. "Frederick, Frederick, come to me. I am dying. Little first-born child, come to me once again." She was in violent hysterics. Margaret went and called Dixon in terror. Dixon came in a huff, and accused Margaret of having over-excited her mother. Margaret bore all meekly, only trusting that her father might not return. In spite of her alarm, which was even greater than the occasion warranted, she obeyed all Dixon's directions promptly and well, without a word of self-justification. By so doing she mollified her accuser. They put her mother to bed, and Margaret sat by her till she fell asleep, and afterwards till Dixon beckoned her out of the room, and, with a sour face, as if doing something against the grain, she bade her drink a cup of coffee which she had prepared for her in the drawing-room, and stood over her in a commanding attitude as she did so. "You shouldn't have been so curious, miss, and then you wouldn't have needed to fret before your time. It would have come soon enough. And now, I suppose, you'll tell master, and a pretty household I shall have of you." "No, Dixon," said Margaret, sorrowfully. "I will not tell papa. He could not bear it as I can," and by way of proving how well she bore it, she burst into tears. "Aye, I knew how it would be. Now you'll waken your mamma, just after she's gone to sleep so quietly." "Miss Margaret, my dear, I've had to keep it down this many a week, and though I don't pretend I can love her as you do, yet I loved her better than any other man, woman, or child. No one but Master Frederick ever came near her in my mind. Ever since Lady Bereford's maid first took me in to see her dressed out in white crape, and corn ears, and scarlet poppies, and I ran a needle down into my finger and broke it in, and she tore up her work pocket handkerchief, after they'd cut it out, and came in to wet the bandages again with lotion when she returned from the ball, where she'd been the prettiest young lady of all. I've never loved any one like her. I little thought then that I should live to see her brought so low. I don't mean no reproach to nobody. Many a one calls you pretty and handsome, and what not, even in this smoky place, enough to blind one's eyes. The owls can see that. But you'll never be like your mother for beauty, never, not if you live to be 100. Mamma is very pretty still. Poor mamma! Now don't ye set off again, or I shall give way at last," whimpering. "You'll never stand master's coming home, and questioning at this rate. Go out and take a walk, and come in something like. Many's the time I've longed to walk it off, the thought of what was the matter with her, and how it must all end." "Oh, Dixon," said Margaret, "how often I've been cross with you, not knowing what a terrible secret you had to bear." "Bless you, child, I like to see you showing a bit of a spirit. It's the good old Beresford blood. Why, the last Sir John but two shot his steward down, there where he stood, for just telling him that he'd raked the tenants. And he'd raked the tenants till he could get no more money off them than he could get skin off a flint. Well, Dixon, I won't shoot you, and I'll try not to be cross again. You never have. If I've said it at times, it has always been to myself, just in private, by way of making a little agreeable conversation, for there's no one here fit to talk to. And when you fire up, you're the very image of Master Frederick. I could find in my heart to put you in a passion any day, just to see his stormy look coming like a great cloud over your face. But now you go out, miss. I'll watch over missus, and as for master, his books are company enough for him, if he should come in." "I will go," said Margaret. She hung about Dixon for a minute or so, as if afraid and irresolute. Then suddenly kissing her, she went quickly out of the room. "Bless her," said Dixon. "She's as sweet as a nut. There are three people I love. It's Mrs. Master Frederick and her. Just them three. That's all. The rest be hanged, for I don't know what they're in the world for. Master was born, I suppose, for to marry missus. If I thought he loved her properly, I might get to love him in time. But he shouldn't ha' made a deal more on her, and not been always reading, thinking. See what it has brought him to. Many a one who never reads nor thinks either, gets to be rector and dean and what not, and I dare say master might, if he just minded missus, and let the weary reading and thinking alone. There she goes, looking out of the window as she heard the front door shut. Poor young lady! Her clothes look shabby to what they did when she came to Helstone a year ago. Then she hadn't so much as a darn stocking or a clean pair of gloves in all her wardrobe. And now—" End of chapter 16. Chapter 17. North and South. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This reading by Lucy Burgoyne. North and South by Elizabeth Cleghorn Gaskell. Chapter 17. What is a strike? There are briars besetting every path, which call for patient care. There is a cross in every lot, and an earnest need for prayer. Anon. Margaret went out heavily and unwillingly enough, but the length of a street, yes, the air of a Milton street, cheered her young blood before she reached her first turning. Her step grew lighter, her lip redder. She began to take notice, instead of having her thoughts turned so exclusively inward. She saw unusual loiterers in the streets, men with their hands in their pockets sauntering along, loud laughing and loud-spoken girls clustered together, apparently excited to high spirits and a boisterous independence of temper and behaviour. The more ill-looking of the men, the discreditable minority, hung about on the steps of the beer-houses and gin-shops, smoking and commenting pretty freely on every passer-by. Margaret disliked the prospect of the long walk through these streets before she came to the fields which she had planned to reach. Instead, she would go and see Bessie Higgins. It would not be so refreshing as a quiet country walk, but still it would perhaps be doing the kinder thing. Nicholas Higgins was sitting by the fire smoking. As she went in, Bessie was rocking herself on the other side. Nicholas took the pipe out of his mouth, and standing up, pushed his chair towards Margaret. He leant against the chimney piece in a lounging attitude, while she asked Bessie how she was. "Who's rather down in the mouth in regard to spirits, but who's better in health? Who doesn't like this strike? Who's a deal too much set on peace and quietness at any price?" "This is the third strike I've seen," said she, sighing, as if that was answer and explanation enough. "Well, third time pays for all. See if we don't dang the masters this time. See if they don't come and beg us to come back at our own price. That's all. We've missed it afore time, I grant yer, but this time we'd laid our plans desperate deep." "Why do you strike?" asked Margaret. "Striking is leaving off work till you get your own rate of wages, is it not?" "You must not wonder at my ignorance. Where I come from I never heard of a strike." "I wish I was there," said Bessie, wearily, "but it's not for me to get sick and tired of strikes. This is the last I'll see. Before it's ended I shall be in the great city, the holy Jerusalem. Who's so full of the life to come, who cannot think of the present? Now I, you see, am bound to do the best I can here. I think a bird either hand is worth two either bush. So them's the different views we take on the strike question." "But," said Margaret, "if the people struck, as you call it, where I come from, as they are mostly all field labourers, the seed would not be sown, the hay got in, the corn reaped." "Well?" said he. He had resumed his pipe, and put his "well" in the form of an interrogation. "Why," she went on, "what would become of the farmers?" He puffed away. "I reckon they'd have either to give up their farms or to give fair rate of wage." "Suppose they could not, or would not do the last? They could not give up their farms all in a minute, however much they might wish to do so. But they would have no hay, nor corn to sell that year, and where would the money come from to pay the labourers' wages the next?" Still puffing away, at last he said, "I know nought of your ways down south. I have heard they're a pack of spiritless, downtrodden men, well yclemmed to death. Too much daze wi' clemming to know when they're put upon. Now it's not so here. We known when we're put upon, and we'm too much blood in us to stand it. We just take our hands from our looms, and say, 'Yo may clemm us, but you'll not put upon us, my masters.' And be danged to 'em, they shan't this time." "I wish I lived down south," said Bessie. "There's a deal to bear there," said Margaret. "There are sorrows to bear everywhere. There is very hardly bodily labour to be gone through, with very little food to give strength." "But it's out of doors," said Bessie, "and away from the endless, endless noise and sickening heat. It's sometimes in heavy rain, and sometimes in bitter cold. A young person can stand it, but an old man gets raked with rheumatism, and bent and withered before his time, yet he must just work on the same, or else go to the workhouse." "I thought yo were so taken with the ways of the south country." "So I am," said Margaret, smiling a little, as she found herself thus caught. "I only mean, Bessie, there's good and bad in everything in this world, and as you felt the bad up here, I thought it was but fair you should know the bad down there." "And yo say they never strike down there?" asked Nicholas abruptly. "No," said Margaret. "I think they have too much sense." "And I think," replied he, dashing the ashes out of his pipe with so much vehemence that it broke, "it's not that they've too much sense, but that they've too little spirit." "Oh, father," said Bessie, "what have ye gained by striking? Think of the first strike when mother died, How we all had to clem, you the worst of all, and yet many a one went in every week at the same wage, till all were gone in that there was work for, and some went beggars all their lives at after. Ay, said he, that their strike was badly managed. Folk got into the management of it, as were either fools or not true men. You'll see, it'll be different this time. But all this time you've not told me what you're striking for, said Margaret again. Why, yo see, there's 5 or 6 masters who have set themselves again paying the wages they've been paying these 2 years past, and flourishing upon, and getting richer upon. And now they come to us, and say we're to take less, and we won't. We'll just clem them to death first, and see who'll work for 'em then. They'll have killed the goose that laid 'em the golden eggs, I reckon. And so you plan dying, in order to be revenged upon them? No, he said, I done it. I just look forward to the chance of dying at my post sooner than yield. That's what folk call fine and honourable in a soldier. And why not in a poor weaver chap? But, said Margaret, a soldier dies in the cause of the nation, in the cause of others. He laughed grimly. My lass, said he, you're but a young wench, but don't you think I can keep 3 people? That's Bessie, and Mary, and me, on 16 shilling a week. Don't you think it's worth myself? I'm striking work at this time. It's just as much in the cause of others as yon soldier, only m'appen the cause he dies for is just that of somebody he never clapped eyes on, nor heard on all his born days, while I take up John Butcher's cause, as lives next door but one, with a sickly wife and 8 childer, none of 'em factory age, and I don't take up his cause only, though he's a poor good for nought, as can only manage 2 looms at a time, but I take up the cause of justice. Why are we to have less wage now, I ask, than 2 year ago? Don't ask me, said Margaret. I am very ignorant. Ask some of your masters. Surely they will give you a reason for it. It is not merely an arbitrary decision of theirs, come to without reason. You're just a foreigner, and nothing more, said he, contemptuously. Much you know about it. Ask the masters. They'd tell us to mind our own business, and they'd mind theirs. Our business being, you understand, to take the battered wage, and be thankful, and their business to bait us down to clemming point, to swell their profits. That's what it is. But, said Margaret, determined not to give way, although she knew she was irritating him, the state of trade may be such as not to enable them to give you the same remuneration. State of trade, that's just a piece of master's humbug. It's rate of wages I was talking of. The masters keep the state of trade in their own hands, and just walk it forward like a black bugaboo, to frighten naughty children with into being good. I'll tell you it's their part, their cue, as some folks call it, to beat us down, to swell their fortunes, and it's ours to stand up and fight hard, not for ourselves alone, but for them round us, for justice and fair play. We help to make their profits, and we ought to help spend 'em. It's not that we want their brass so much this time, as we've done many a time afore. We're getting money laid by, and we're resolved to stand and fall together. Not a man on us will go in for less wage than the union says is our due. So I say, hooray for the strike, and let Thornton and Slickson and Hamper and their set look to it. Thornton, said Margaret. Mr. Thornton of Mulberry Street. Ay, Thornton, of Mulberry Mill, as we call him. He is one of the masters you are striving with, is he not? What sort of a master is he? Did you ever see a bulldog? Set a bulldog on hind legs, and dress him up in a coat and breeches, and you're just getting John Thornton." "Nah," said Margaret, laughing. "I deny that. Mr. Thornton is plain enough, but he's not like a bulldog, with its short broad nose, and snarling upper lip." "No, not in look, I grant you. But let John Thornton get hold on a notion, and he'll stick to it like a bulldog. You might pull him away with a pitchfork ere he'd leave go. He's worth fighting with, is John Thornton. As for Slickson, I take it, some of these days he'll wheedle his men back with fair promises, that they'll just get cheated out of as soon as they're in his power again. He'll work his fines well out of 'em, I'll warrant. He's as slippery as an eel, he is. He's like a cat, as sleek and cunning and fierce. It'll never be an honest up and down fight with him, as it will be with Thornton. Thornton's a dour as a doornail, an obstinate chap, every inch of him. The old bulldog." "Poor Bessie," said Margaret, turning round to her. "You sigh over it all. You don't like struggling and fighting as your father does, do you?" "No," said she, heavily. "I'm sick of it. I could have wished to have had other talk about me in my latter days, than just the clashing and clanging and clattering that has wearied a my life long, about work and wages and masters and hands and knobsticks. Poor wench, latter days be farred. Thou'rt looking a sight better already for a little stir change. Beside, I shall be a deal here to make it more lively for thee." "Tobacco smoke chokes me," said she, querulously. "Then I'll never smoke no more. I'd a house," he replied tenderly. "But why didst thou not tell me afore, thou foolish wench?" She did not speak for a while, and then so low that only Margaret heard her. "I reckon he'll want a' the comfort he can get out of either pipe or drink afore he's done." Her father went out of doors, evidently to finish his pipe. Bessie said passionately: "Now am I not a fool? Am I not, miss? There, I knew I ought for to keep father at home, and away from the folk that are always ready for to tempt him, in time o' strike, to go drink, and there my tongue must needs quarrel with this pipe of his'n, and he'll go off, I know he will, as often as he wants to smoke, and nobody knows where it'll end. I wish I'd letten myself be choked first." "But does your father drink?" asked Margaret. "No, not to say drink," replied she, still in the same wild, excited tone. "But what would ye have? There are days with you, as with other folks, I suppose, when ye get up and go through the hours, just longing for a bit of a change, a bit of a fillip, as it were. I know I have gone and bought a 4-pounder out of another baker's shop to common on such days, just because I sickened at the thought of going on for ever with the same sight in my eyes, and the same sound in my ears, and the same taste in my mouth, and the same thought, or no thought, for that matter, in my head, day after day, for ever. I've longed for to be a man to go spreeing, even if it were only a tramp to some new place in search of work. And father, all men have it stronger in 'em than me to get tired of sameness and work for ever. And what is 'em to do? It's little blame to them if they do go into the gin shop for to make their blood flow quicker and more lively, and see things they never see at no other time, pictures, and looking-glass, and such like. But father never was a drunkard, though maybe he's got worse for drink, now and then, only you see," and now her voice took a mournful, pleading tone, "at times a strike, there's much to knock a man down, for all they start so hopefully, and where's the comfort to come fra? He'll get angry and mad, they all do, and then they get tired out with being angry and mad, and maybe had done things in their passion they'd be glad to forget. Bless your sweet pitiful face, but you dunn't know what a strike is yet." "Come, Bessie," said Margaret, "I won't say you're exaggerating, because I don't know enough about it. But perhaps, as you're not well, you're only looking on one side, and there is another and a brighter to be looked to." "It's all well enough for you to say so, who have lived in pleasant green places all your life long, and never known want or care, or wickedness either, for that matter." "Take care," said Margaret, her cheek flushing, and her eye lightening. "How you judge, Bessie. I shall go home to my mother, who is so ill, Bessie, that there's no outlet but death for her out of the prison of her great suffering. And yet I must speak cheerfully to my father, who has no notion of her real state, and to whom the knowledge must come gradually. The only one who could sympathize with me and help me, whose presence could comfort my mother more than any other earthly thing, is falsely accused, would run the risk of death if he came to see his dying mother. This I tell you, only you, Bessie. You must not mention it. No other person in Milton, hardly any other person in England knows. Have I not care? Do I not know anxiety, though I go about well dressed and have food enough? Oh, Bessie, God is just, and our lots are well portioned out by Him, although none but He knows the bitterness of our souls." "I ask your pardon," replied Bessie, humbly. "Sometimes when I've thought of my life and the little pleasures I've had in it, I've believed that maybe I was one of those doomed to die by the falling of a star from heaven, and the name of the star is called wormwood, and the third part of the waters became wormwood, and the men died of the waters, because they were made bitter. One can bear pain and sorrow better if one thinks it has been prophesied long before for one. Somehow, then it seems as if my pain was needed for the fulfilment. Otherwise, it seems all sent for nothing." "Nay, Bessie, think," said Margaret. "God does not willingly afflict. Don't dwell so much on the prophecies, but read the clearer parts of the Bible." "I dare say it would be wiser, but where would I hear such grand words of promise, hear tell o' anything so far different fro this dreary world, and this town above a', as in Revelations? Many's the time I've repeated the verses in the 7th chapter to myself, just for the sound. It's as good as an organ, and as different from every day too. No, I cannot give up Revelations. It gives me more comfort than any other book in the Bible. Let me come and read you some of my favourite chapters." "Ay," said she, greedily, "come, father will maybe hear you. He's deed with me talking. He says it's all nought to do with the things o' to-day, and that's his business." "Where is your sister?" "Gone fusty and cutting. I were loath to let her go, but somehow we must live, and the Union can't afford us much. Now I must go. You have done me good, Bessie." "I done you good?" "Yes. I came here very sad, and rather too apt to think my own cause for grief was the only one in the world, and now I hear how you have had to bear for years, and that makes me stronger. Bless yer, I thought a' the good doing was on the side of gentlefolk. I shall get proud if I think I can do good to you." "You won't do it if you think about it, but you'll only puzzle yourself if you do. That's one comfort." "You're not like no one I ever seed. I dunno what to make of yer." "Nor I of myself. Good bye." Bessie stilled her rocking to gaze after her. "I wonder if there are many folk like her down south. She's like a breath of country air, somehow. She freshes me up above a bit." Who'd have thought that face, as bright as strong as the angel I dream of, could have known the sorrow she speaks on? I wonder how she'll sin. All on us must sin. I think a deal on her, for sure. But father does the like, I see, and Mary even. It's not often who's stirred up to notice much. End of chapter 17.
Chapter 18 of North and South. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Leanne Howlett. North and South by Elizabeth Cleghorn Gaskell. Chapter 18. Likes and Dislikes. My heart revolts within me, and two voices make themselves audible within my bosom. Wallenstein. On Margaret's return home she found two letters on the table. One was a note for her mother. The other, which had come by the post, was evidently from her Aunt Shaw, covered with foreign postmarks, thin, silvery, and rustling. She took up the other and was examining it, when her father came in suddenly. "So your mother is tired and gone to bed early. I'm afraid such a thundery day was not the best in the world for the doctor to see her. What did he say? Dixon tells me he spoke to you about her." Margaret hesitated. Her father's looks became more grave and anxious. "He does not think her seriously ill?" "Not at present. She needs care, he says. He was very kind, and said he would call again and see how his medicines worked." Only care. He did not recommend change of air? He did not say this smoky town was doing her any harm, did he, Margaret? "No, not a word," she replied gravely. "He was anxious, I think." "Doctors have that anxious manner. It's professional," said he. Margaret saw, in her father's nervous ways, that the first impression of possible danger was made upon his mind, in spite of all his making light of what she told him. He could not forget the subject, could not pass from it to other things. He kept recurring to it through the evening, with an unwillingness to receive even the slightest unfavourable idea, which made Margaret inexpressibly sad. "This letter is from Aunt Shaw, Papa. She has got to Naples and finds it too hot, so she has taken apartments at Sorrento. But I don't think she likes Italy." "He did not say anything about diet, did he?" "It was to be nourishing and digestible. Mamma's appetite is pretty good, I think." "Yes, and that makes it all the more strange he should have thought of speaking about diet." "I asked him, Papa." Another pause. Then Margaret went on. "Aunt Shaw says she has sent me some coral ornaments, Papa, but," added Margaret, half smiling, "she's afraid the Milton Dissenters won't appreciate them. She has got all her ideas of Dissenters from the Quakers, has not she?" "If ever you hear or notice that your mother wishes for anything, be sure to let me know. I am so afraid she does not tell me always what she would like. Pray, see after that girl Mrs. Thornton named. If we had a good, efficient house servant, Dixon could be constantly with her, and I'd answer for it we'd soon set her up amongst us, if care will do it. She's been very much tired of late with the hot weather, and the difficulty of getting a servant. A little rest will put her quite to rights, eh, Margaret?" "I hope so," said Margaret, but so sadly that her father took notice of it. He pinched her cheek. "Come, if you look so pale as this, I must rouge you up a little. Take care of yourself, child, or you'll be wanting the doctor next." But he could not settle to anything that evening. He was continually going backwards and forwards on laborious tiptoe to see if his wife was still asleep. Margaret's heart ached at his restlessness, his trying to stifle and strangle the hideous fear that was looming out of the dark places of his heart. He came back at last, somewhat comforted. "She's awake now, Margaret. She quite smiled as she saw me standing by her, just her old smile, and she says she feels refreshed and ready for tea. Where's the note for her? She wants to see it. I'll read it to her while you make tea." The note proved to be a formal invitation from Mrs. Thornton to Mr., Mrs., and Miss Hale to dinner on the 21st instant. Margaret was surprised to find an acceptance contemplated. After all, she had learnt of sad probabilities during the day. But so it was. The idea of her husband's and daughters going to this dinner had quite captivated Mrs. Hale's fancy, even before Margaret had heard the contents of the note. It was an event to diversify the monotony of the invalid's life, and she clung to the idea of their going, with even fretful pertinacity, when Margaret objected. "Nay, Margaret? If she wishes it, I'm sure we'll both go willingly. She never would wish it unless she felt herself really stronger, really better than we thought she was, eh, Margaret?" said Mr. Hale anxiously, as she prepared to write the note of acceptance the next day. "Eh, Margaret?" questioned he, with a nervous motion of his hands. It seemed cruel to refuse him the comfort he craved for, and besides, his passionate refusal to admit the existence of fear almost inspired Margaret herself with hope. "I do think she is better since last night," said she. "Her eyes look brighter and her complexion clearer." "God bless you," said her father earnestly. "But is it true? Yesterday was so sultry every one felt ill. It was a most unlucky day for Mr. Donaldson to see her on." So he went away to his day's duties, now increased by the preparation of some lectures he had promised to deliver to the working people at a neighbouring lyceum. He had chosen ecclesiastical architecture as his subject, rather more in accordance with his own taste and knowledge than as falling in with the character of the place or the desire for particular kinds of information among those to whom he was to lecture. And the institution itself, being in debt, was only too glad to get a gratis course from an educated and accomplished man like Mr. Hale, let the subject be what it might. "Well, mother," asked Mr. Thornton that night, "who have accepted your invitations for the 21st? "Fanny, where are the notes? The Slicksons accept, Collingbrooks accept, Stevensons accept, Browns decline, Hales, father and daughter come, mother too great an invalid, Macphersons come, and Mr. Horsfall, and Mr. Young. I was thinking of asking the Porters, as the Browns can't come." "Very good. Do you know, I'm really afraid Mrs. Hale is very far from well, from what Dr. Donaldson says." "It's strange of them to accept a dinner invitation if she's very ill," said Fanny. "I didn't say very ill," said her brother rather sharply. "I only said very far from well. They may not know it either." And then he suddenly remembered that, from what Dr. Donaldson had told him, Margaret, at any rate, must be aware of the exact state of the case. "Very probably they are quite aware of what you said yesterday, John, of the great advantage it would be to them, to Mr. Hale, I mean, to be introduced to such people as the Stevensons and the Collingbrooks." "I'm sure that motive would not influence them. No, I think I understand how it is." "John," said Fanny, laughing in her little weak, nervous way, "how you profess to understand these Hales, and how you never will allow that we can know anything about them. Are they really so very different to most people one meets with?" She did not mean to vex him, but if she had intended it, she could not have done it more thoroughly. He chafed in silence, however, not deigning to reply to her question. "They do not seem to me out of the common way," said Mrs. Thornton. "He appears a worthy kind of man enough, rather too simple for trade, so it's perhaps as well he should have been a clergyman first, and now a teacher. She's a bit of a fine lady, with her invalidism, and as for the girl, she's the only one who puzzles me when I think about her, which I don't often do. She seems to have a great notion of giving herself airs, and I can't make out why. I could almost fancy she thinks herself too good for her company at times, and yet they're not rich, from all I can hear they never have been." "And she's not accomplished, mamma. She can't play." "Go on, Fanny. What else does she want to bring her up to your standard?" "Nay, John," said his mother, "that speech of Fanny's did no harm. I myself heard Miss Hale say she could not play. If you would let us alone, we would perhaps like her and see her merits." "I'm sure I never could," murmured Fanny, protected by her mother. Mr. Thornton heard, but did not care to reply. He was walking up and down the dining room, wishing that his mother would order candles, and allow him to set to work at either reading or writing, and so put a stop to the conversation. But he never thought of interfering in any of the small domestic regulations that Mrs. Thornton observed, in habitual remembrance of her old economies. "Mother," said he, stopping and bravely speaking out the truth, "I wish you would like Miss Hale." "Why?" asked she, startled by his earnest yet tender manner. "You're never thinking of marrying her, a girl without a penny?" "She would never have me," said he, with a short laugh. "No, I don't think she would," answered his mother. "She laughed in my face when I praised her for speaking out something Mr. Bell had said in your favour. I liked the girl for doing it so frankly, for it made me sure she had no thought of you, and the next minute she vexed me so by seeming to think—well, never mind. Only you're right in saying she's too good an opinion of herself to think of you. The saucy jade! I should like to know where she'd find a better." If these words hurt her son, the dusky light prevented him from betraying any emotion. In a minute he came up quite cheerfully to his mother, and putting one hand lightly on her shoulder, said: "Well, as I'm just as much convinced of the truth of what you have been saying as you can be, and as I have no thought or expectation of ever asking her to be my wife, you'll believe me for the future that I'm quite disinterested in speaking about her. I foresee trouble for that girl, perhaps want of motherly care, and I only wish you to be ready to be a friend to her in case she needs one. Now, Fanny," said he, "I trust you have delicacy enough to understand that it is as great an injury to Miss Hale as to me, in fact she would think it a greater, to suppose that I have any reason, more than I now give, for begging you and my mother to show her every kindly attention." "I cannot forgive her pride," said his mother. "I will befriend her, if there is need, for your asking, John. I would befriend Jezebel herself if you asked me. But this girl, who turns up her nose at us all, who turns up her nose at you! Nay, mother, I have never yet put myself, and I mean never to put myself, within reach of her contempt." "Contempt, indeed! Don't go on speaking of Miss Hale, John, if I've got to be kind to her. When I'm with her I don't know if I like or dislike her most, but when I think of her, and hear you talk of her, I hate her. I can see she's given herself airs to you as well as if you'd told me out." "And if she has," said he, and then he paused for a moment, then went on, "I'm not a lad, to be cowed by a proud look from a woman, or to care for her misunderstanding me and my position. I can laugh at it." "To be sure, and at her too, with her fine notions and haughty tosses." "I only wonder why you talk so much about her then," said Fanny. "I'm sure I'm tired enough of the subject." "Well," said her brother, with a shade of bitterness, "suppose we find some more agreeable subject. What do you say to a strike, by way of something pleasant to talk about?" "Have the hands actually turned out?" asked Mrs. Thornton, with vivid interest. "Hamper's men are actually out. Mine are working out their week. Through fear of being prosecuted for breach of contract, I'd have had every one of them up and punished for it, that left his work before his time was out. The law expenses would have been more than the hands themselves were worth, a set of ungrateful knots," said his mother. "To be sure, but I'd have shown them how I keep my word, and how I mean them to keep theirs. They know me by this time." "Slickson's men are off. Pretty certain he won't spend money in getting them punished. We're in for a turnout, mother." "I hope there are not many orders in hand." "Of course there are. They know that well enough, but they don't quite understand all, though they think they do." "What do you mean, John?" Candles had been brought, and Fanny had taken up her interminable piece of worsted work, over which she was yawning, throwing herself back in her chair from time to time to gaze at vacancy and think of nothing at her ease. "Why," said he, "the Americans are getting their yarns so into the general market that our only chance is producing them at a lower rate. If we can't, we may shut up shop at once, and hands and masters go alike on tramp. Yet these fools go back to the prices paid 3 years ago. Nay, some of their leaders quote Dickinson's prices now, though they know as well as we do that, what with fines pressed out of their wages as no honourable man would extort them, and other ways which I for one would scorn to use, the real rate of wage paid at Dickinson's is less than at ours. Upon my word, mother, I wish the old combination laws were in force. It is too bad to find out that fools, ignorant wayward men like these, just by uniting their weak silly heads, are to rule over the fortunes of those who bring all the wisdom that knowledge and experience, and often painful thought and anxiety, can give. The next thing will be, indeed we're all but come to it now, that we shall have to go and ask, stand hat in hand, and humbly ask the Secretary of the Spinners' Union to be so kind as to furnish us with labour at their own price. That's what they want, they who haven't the sense to see that. If we don't get a fair share of the profits to compensate us for our wear and tear here in England, we can move off to some other country, and that, what with home and foreign competition, we are none of us likely to make above a fair share, and may be thankful enough if we can get that in an average number of years. Can't you get hands from Ireland? I wouldn't keep these fellows a day. I'd teach them that I was master and could employ what servants I liked. Yes, to be sure I can, and I will too if they go on long. It will be trouble and expense, and I fear there will be some danger, but I will do it rather than give in. If there is to be all this extra expense, I'm sorry we're giving a dinner just now. So am I, not because of the expense, but because I shall have much to think about and many unexpected calls on my time. But we must have had Mr. Horsfall, and he does not stay in Milton long. And as for the others, we owe them dinners, and it's all one trouble." He kept on with his restless walk, not speaking any more, but drawing a deep breath from time to time, as if endeavouring to throw off some annoying thought. Fanny asked her mother numerous small questions, all having nothing to do with the subject, which a wiser person would have perceived was occupying her attention. Consequently she received many short answers. She was not sorry when at 10 o'clock the servants filed in to prayers. These her mother always read, first reading a chapter. They were now working steadily through the Old Testament. When prayers were ended and his mother had wished him good night, with that long, steady look of hers which conveyed no expression of the tenderness that was in her heart, but yet had the intensity of a blessing, Mr. Thornton continued his walk. All his business plans had received a check, a sudden pull-up, from this approaching turn-out. The forethought of many anxious hours was thrown away, utterly wasted by their insane folly, which would injure themselves even more than him, though no one could set any limit to the mischief they were doing. And these were the men who thought themselves fitted to direct the masters in the disposal of their capital. Hamper had said, only this very day, that if he were ruined by the strike, he would start life again, comforted by the conviction that those who brought it on were in a worse predicament than he himself. For he had head as well as hands, while they had only hands, and if they drove away their market, they could not follow it, nor turn to anything else. But this thought was no consolation to Mr. Thornton. It might be that revenge gave him no pleasure. It might be that he valued the position he had earned with the sweat of his brow, so much that he keenly felt its being endangered by the ignorance or folly of others, so keenly that he had no thoughts to spare for what would be the consequences of their conduct to themselves. He paced up and down, setting his teeth a little now and then. At last it struck 2. The candles were flickering in their sockets. He lighted his own, muttering to himself, "Once for all, they shall know whom they have got to deal with. I can give them a fortnight, no more. If they don't see their madness before the end of that time, I must have hands from Ireland. I believe it's Slickson's doing, confound him and his dodges. He thought he was overstocked, so he seemed to yield at first when the deputation came to him, and of course he only confirmed them in their folly, as he meant to do. That's where it spread from." End of chapter 18. Recording by Leanne Howlett.
North and South. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Gemma Blythe. North and South by Elizabeth Cleghorn Gaskell. Chapter 19. Angel Visits. As angels in some brighter dreams call to the soul when man doth sleep, so some strange thoughts transcend our wanton themes, and into glory peep. Henry Vaughan. Mrs. Hale was curiously amused and interested by the idea of the Thornton dinner party. She kept wondering about the details, with something of the simplicity of a little child who wants to have all its anticipated pleasures described beforehand. But the monotonous life led by invalids often makes them like children, inasmuch as they have neither of them any sense of proportion in events, and seem each to believe that the walls and curtains which shut in their world and shut out everything else must of necessity be larger than anything hidden beyond. Besides, Mrs. Hale had had her vanities as a girl, had perhaps unduly felt their mortification when she became a poor clergyman's wife. They had been smothered and kept down, but they were not extinct, and she liked to think of seeing Margaret dressed for a party, and discussed what she should wear, with an unsettled anxiety that amused Margaret, who had been more accustomed to society in her 1 in Harley Street than her mother in 5 in 20 years of Hellstone. "Then you think you shall wear your white silk? Are you sure it will fit? It's nearly a year since Edith was married." "Oh, yes, mamma. Mrs. Murray made it, and it's sure to be right. It may be a straw's breadth shorter or longer waisted, according to my having grown fat or thin, but I don't think I've altered in the least. Hadn't you better let Dixon see it? It may have gone yellow with lying by." "If you like, mamma. But if the worst comes to the worst, I've a very nice pink gauze, which Aunt Shaw gave me only 2 or 3 months before Edith was married. That can't have gone yellow. No, but it may have faded. Well, then I've a green silk. I feel more as if it was the embarrassment of riches." "I wish I knew what you ought to wear," said Mrs. Hale nervously. Margaret's manner changed instantly. "Shall I go and put them on, one after another, mamma, and then you could see which you liked best?" "But yes, that will be best." So off Margaret went. She was very much inclined to play some pranks when she was dressed up at such an unusual hour, to make her rich white silk balloon out into a cheese, to retreat backwards from her mother as if she were the queen. But when she found that these freaks of hers were regarded as interruptions to the serious business, and as such annoyed her mother, she became grave and sedate. What had possessed the world, her world, to fidget so about her dress, she could not understand. But that very afternoon, on naming her engagement to Bessie Higgins, apropos of the servant that Mrs. Thornton had promised to inquire about, Bessie quite roused up at the intelligence. "Dear, and are you going to dine at Thornton's at Marlborough Mills?" "Yes, Bessie. Why are you so surprised?" "Oh, I don't know. But they visit with the first folk in Milton." "And you don't think we're quite the first folk in Milton, eh, Bessie?" Bessie's cheeks flushed a little at her thought being thus easily read. "Well," said she, "you see, they thinking a deal of money here, and I reckon you've not gotten much." "No," said Margaret, "that's very true. But we are educated people, and have lived amongst educated people. Is there anything so wonderful in our being asked out to dinner by a man who owns himself inferior to my father by coming to him to be instructed? I don't mean to blame Mr. Thornton. Few drapers' assistants, as he was once, could have made themselves what he is. But can you give dinners back in your small house? Thornton's house is 3 times as big." "Well, I think we could manage to give Mr. Thornton a dinner back, as you call it. Perhaps not in such a large room, nor with so many people, but I don't think we've thought about it at all in that way." "I never thought you'd be dining with Thorntons," repeated Bessie. "Why, the mayor hisself dines there, and the members of Parliament and all. I think I could support the honor of meeting the mayor of Milton." "But them ladies dress so grand," said Bessie, with an anxious look at Margaret's print gown, which her Milton eyes appraised at 7d. a yard. Margaret's face dimpled up into a merry laugh. "Thank you, Bessie, for thinking so kindly about my looking nice among all the smart people. But I've plenty of grand gowns. A week ago I should have said they were far too grand for anything I should ever want again. But as I'm to dine at Mr. Thornton's, and perhaps to meet the mayor, I shall put on my very best gown, you may be sure." "What would you wear?" asked Bessie, somewhat relieved. "White silk," said Margaret. "A gown I had for a cousin's wedding a year ago." "That'll do," said Bessie, falling back in her chair. "I should be loath to have you looked down upon." "Oh, I'll be fine enough, if that will save me from being looked down upon in Milton." "I wish I could see you dressed up," said Bessie. "I reckon you're not what folk would call pretty. You're not red and white enough for that. But don't you know, I had dreamt of you long afore ever I'd seed you." "Nonsense, Bessie." "Ah, but I did. Your very face, looking with your clear, steadfast eyes out of the darkness, with your hair blown off from your brow and going out like rays round your forehead, which was just as smooth and as straight as it is now. And you always came to give me strength, which I seemed to gather out of your deep, comforting eyes. And you were dressed in shining raiment, just as you're going to be dressed. So, you see, it was you." "Nay, Bessie," said Margaret gently, "it was but a dream." "But why mightn't I dream a dream in my affliction as well as others. Did not many a one in the Bible? And see visions too. Why, even my father thinks a deal of dreams. I tell you again, I saw you as plainly coming swiftly towards me, with your hair blown back, with the very swiftness of the motion, just like the way it grows, a little standing off like. And the white shining dress on you've gotten to wear. Let me come and see in it. I want to see you and touch you, as if in very deed you were in my dream. My dear Bessie, it is quite a fancy of yours, fancy or no fancy. You've come, as I knew you would, when I saw you movement in my dream, and when you're here about me, I reckon I feel easier in my mind and comforted, just as a fire comforts one on a dreary day. You said it were on the 21st. Please God, I'll come and see you. Oh, Bessie, you may come and welcome, but don't talk so. It really makes me sorry, it does indeed. Then I'll keep it to myself, if I bite my tongue out. Not but what it's true for all that. Margaret was silent. At last she said, "Let us talk about it sometimes, if you think it true, but not now. Tell me, has your father turned out?" "Eh," said Bessie heavily, in a manner very different from that she had spoken in but a minute or two before. "He and many another, all Hampers men, and many a one besides. The women are as bad as the men in their savageness this time. Food is high, and they mun have food for their childer, I reckon. Suppose Thornton sent 'em their dinner out. The same money spent on potatoes and meal would keep many a crying babby quiet, and hush up its mother's heart for a bit." "Don't speak so," said Margaret. "You'll make me feel wicked and guilty in going to this dinner." "No," said Bessie. "Some pre-elected to sumptuous feasts and purple and fine linen. Maybe you're one on 'em. Others toil and moil all their lives long, and the very dogs are not pitiful in our days, as they were in the days of Lazarus. But if you ask me to cool your tongue with the tip of my finger, I'll come across the great gulf to you, just for the thought of what you've been to me here. Bessie, you're very feverish. I can tell it in the touch of your hand, as well as in what you're saying. It won't be division enough in that awful day, that some of us have been beggars here, and some of us have been rich. We shall not be judged by that poor accident, but by our faithful following of Christ." Margaret got up and found some water, and soaking her pocket handkerchief in it, she laid the cool wetness on Bessie's forehead, and began to chafe the stone-cold feet. Bessie shut her eyes and allowed herself to be soothed. At last she said, "You'd have been deaved out of your 5 wits, as well as me, if you'd have one body after another coming in to ask her father, and staying to tell me each one their tale. Some spoke a deadly hatred, and made my blood run cold with the terrible things they said of the masters, but more, being women, kept plaining, with the tears running down their cheeks, and never wiped away nor heeded, of the price of meat, and how their children could not sleep at nights for the hunger." "And do they think the strike will mend this?" asked Margaret. "They say so," replied Bessie. "They do say trade has been good for long, and the masters have made no end of money. How much father doesn't know, but in course the Union does, and, as is natural, they're wanting their share of the profits, now that food is getting dear, and the Union says they'll not be doing their duty if they don't make the masters give 'em their share. But masters has gotten the upper hand somehow, and I'm feared they'll keep it now and evermore. It's like the great battle of Armageddon, the way they keep on grinning and fighting at each other, till even while they fight they are picked off into the pit." Just then Nicholas Higgins came in. He caught his daughter's last words. "And I'll fight on too, and I'll get it this time. It'll not take long for to make 'em give in, for they've getting a pretty lot of orders all under contract, and they'll soon find out they'd better give us our 5% than lose the profit they'll gain, let alone the fine for not fulfilling the contract. My masters, I know'll win." Margaret fancied from his manner that he must have been drinking, not so much from what he said as from the excited way in which he spoke, and she was rather confirmed in this idea by the evident anxiety Bessie showed to hasten her departure. Bessie said to her, The 21st, that's Thursday week. I may come and see you dressed with Thorntons, I reckon. What time is your dinner?" Before Margaret could answer, Higgins broke out. "Thorntons! Are they going to dine at Thornton's? Ask him to give you a bumper to the success of his orders. By the 21st, I reckon, he'll be potted in his brains how to get 'em done in time. Tell him there's 700'll come marching into Marlborough Mills the morning after he gives the 5%, and we'll help him through his contract in no time. You'll have 'em all there. My master, Hamper, he's one of the old-fashioned sort. Never meets a man but an oath or a curse. I should think he were going to die if he spoke me civil, but after all, his bark's worse than spite, and you may tell him one of his turnouts said so if you like. But you'll have a lot of prize mill owners at Thornton's. I should like to get speech of them when they're a bit inclined to sit still after dinner, and couldn't they run for the life on 'em? I'd tell 'em my mind. I'd speak up again the hard way they're driving on us." "Good-bye," said Margaret hastily. "Good-bye, Bessie. I shall look to see you on the 21st, if you're well enough." The medicines and treatment which Dr. Donaldson had ordered for Mrs. Hale did her so much good at first that not only she herself, but Margaret began to hope that he might have been mistaken, and that she could recover permanently. As for Mr. Hale, although he had never had an idea of the serious nature of their apprehensions, he triumphed over their fears with an evident relief, which proved how much his glimpse into the nature of them had affected him. Only Dickson croaked forever into Margaret's ear. However, Margaret defied the raven, and would hope. They needed this gleam of brightness indoors, for out of doors, even to their uninstructed eyes, there was a gloomy, brooding appearance of discontent. Mr. Hale had his own acquaintances among the working-men, and was depressed with their earnestly told tales of suffering and long endurance. They would have scorned to speak of what they had to bear to anyone who might, from his position, have understood it without their words. But here was this man from a distant county who was perplexed by the workings of the system into the midst of which he was thrown, and each was eager to make him a judge, and to bring witness of his own causes for irritation. Then Mr. Hale brought all his budget of grievances, and laid it before Mr. Thornton, for him, with his experience as a master, to arrange them, and explain their origin, which he always did on sound economical principles, showing that as trade was conducted, there must always be a waxing and waning of commercial prosperity, and that in the waning a certain number of masters, as well as of men, must go down into ruin, and be no more seen among the ranks of the happy and prosperous. He spoke as if this consequence was so entirely logical that neither employers nor employed had any right to complain if it became their fate, the employer to turn aside from the race he could no longer run, with a bitter sense of incompetency and failure, wounded in the struggle, trampled down by his fellows in their haste to get rich, slighted where he once was honored, humbly asking for, instead of bestowing, employment with a lordly hand. Of course, speaking so of the fate that, as a master, might be his own in the fluctuations of commerce, he was not likely to have more sympathy with that of the workmen, who were passed by in the swift, merciless improvement or alteration, who would fain lie down and quietly die out of the world that needed them not, but felt as if they could never rest in their graves for the clinging cries of the beloved and helpless they would leave behind, who envied the power of the wild bird that can feed her young with her very heart's blood. Margaret's whole soul rose up against him while he reasoned in this way, as if commerce were everything and humanity nothing. She could hardly thank him for the individual kindness which brought him that very evening to offer her, for the delicacy which made him understand that he must offer her privately every convenience for illness that his own wealth or his mother's foresight had caused them to accumulate in their household, and which, as he learned from Dr. Donaldson, Mrs. Hale might possibly require. His presence, after the way he had spoken, his bringing before her the doom which she was vainly trying to persuade herself might yet be averted from her mother, all conspired to set Margaret's teeth on edge as she looked at and listened to him. What business had he to be the only person, except Dr. Donaldson and Dickson, admitted to the awful secret, which she held shut up in the most dark and sacred recess of her heart, not daring to look at it, unless she invoked heavenly strength to bear the sight, that some day soon she should cry aloud for her mother, and no answer would come out of the blank, dumb darkness? Yet he knew all. She saw it in his pitying eyes. She heard it in his grave and tremulous voice. How reconcile those eyes, that voice, with the hard reasoning, dry, merciless way in which he had laid down axioms of trade, and serenely followed them out to their full consequences? The discord jarred upon her inexpressibly, the more because of the gathering woe of which she heard from Bessie. To be sure, Nicholas Higgins, the father, spoke differently. He had been appointed a committee man, and said that he knew secrets of which the exoteric knew nothing. He said this more expressly and particularly on the very day before Mrs. Thornton's dinner party, when Margaret, going in to speak to Bessie, found him arguing the point with Boucher, the neighbor of whom she had frequently heard mention, as by turns exciting Higgins' compassion, as an unskilful workman with a large family depending upon him for support, and at other times enraging his more energetic and sanguine neighbor by his want of what the latter called spirit. It was very evident that Higgins was in a passion when Margaret entered. Boucher stood with both hands on the rather high mantelpiece, swaying himself a little on the support which his arms, thus placed, gave him, and looked wildly into the fire, with a kind of despair that irritated Higgins, even while it went to his heart. Bessie was rocking herself violently backwards and forwards, as was her wont. Margaret knew by this time when she was agitated. Her sister Mary was tying on her bonnet in great clumsy bows, as suited her great clumsy fingers, to go to her fustian cutting, blubbering out loud the while, and evidently longing to be away from a scene that distressed her. Margaret came in upon this scene. She stood for a moment at the door. Then, her finger on her lips, she stole to a seat on the squab near Bessie. Nicholas saw her come in, and greeted her with a gruff but not unfriendly nod. Mary hurried out of the house, catching gladly at the open door, and crying aloud when she got away from her father's presence. It was only John Boucher that took no notice whatever who came in and who went out. "It's no use, Higgins. Who cannot live long in this? Who's just sinking away, not for want of meat herself, but because who cannot stand the sight of the little ones clemming? Ah, clemming! 5 shillin' a week may do well enough for thee, with but 2 mouths to fill, and one of 'em a wench who can well earn her own meat, but it's clemmin' to us. And I tell thee plain, if hoo dies as I'm feared hoo will afore we've gotten the 5%, I'll fling the money back in the master's face, and say be dommed to you, be dommed to the whole cruel world of you, that could nae leave me the best wife that ever bore childer to a man. And look thee, lad, I'll hate thee, and the whole pack of the Union, and chase you through heaven with my hatred. I will, lad, I will, if you're leading me astray in this matter. Thou saidst, Nicholas, on Wednesday se'nnight, and it's now Tuesday in the 2nd week, that afore a fortnight we had the masters coming a begging to us to take back our work at our own wage, and time's nearly up, and there's our little Jack lying abed, too weak to cry, but just every now and then sobbing up his heart for want of food. Our little Jack, I tell thee, lad, who's never looked up since he was born, and who loves him as if he were her very life, as he is, for I reckon he'll have cost me that precious price, our little Jack, who wakened me each morning with putting his sweet little lips to my great rough face, a seeking a smooth place to kiss, and he lies clemming. Here's the deep sigh, choke the poor man, and Nicholas looked up with eyes brimful of tears to Margaret, before he could gain courage to speak. "Howd up, man. Thy little Jack shall nae clam. I hae getten brass, and will go buy the chap a sup o' milk and a good 4-pounder this very minute. What's mine's thine, sure enough. I thought's once. Only don't lose heart, man," continued he, as he fumbled in a teapot for what money he had. "I lay you my heart and soul will win for all this. It's but bearing on one more week, and you can just see the way the masters'll come round praying on us to come back to the mills. And the Union, that's to say, I will take care of you enough for the childer and the missus, so don't turn faint heart and go to the tyrants a-seeking work." The man turned round at these words, turning round a face so white and gaunt and tear-furrowed and hopeless that its very calm forced Margaret to weep. "You know well that a worse a tyrant than ere the masters were sae clemmed to death, and see him a-clemmed to death, ere you dare go against the Union. You know it well, Nicholas, for you're one on 'em. You may be kind hearts, each separate, but once banded together, you've no more pity for a man than a wild hunger-maddened wolf." Nicholas had his hand on the lock of the door. He stopped and turned round on Boucher, close following. "So help me God, man alive, if I think not I'm doing best for thee and for all on us. If I'm going wrong when I think I'm going right, it's their sin, who have left me where I am in my ignorance. I have thought till my brains ached. Believe me, John, I have. And I say again, there's no help for us but having faith in the Union. They'll win the day. See if they don't." Not one word had Margaret or Bessie spoken. They had hardly uttered the sighing that the eyes of each other called to the other to bring up from the depths of her heart. At last Bessie said, "I never thought to hear father call on God again, but you heard him. So help me God." "Yes," said Margaret. "Let me bring you what money I can spare. Let me bring you a little food for that poor man's children. Don't let them know it comes from any one but your father. It will be but little." Bessie lay back without taking any notice of what Margaret said. She did not cry. She only quivered up her breath. "My heart's drained dry of tears," she said. "Boucher's been in these days past a-telling me of his fears and his troubles. He's but a weak kind of chap, I know, but he's a man for all that, and though I've been angry many a time afore now with him and his wife, as knew no more nor him how to manage, yet you see all folks isn't wise. Yet God lets them live, and gives them some one to love and be loved by, just as good as Solomon. And if sorrow comes to them, they love. It hurts them as sore as ever it did Solomon. I can't make it out. Perhaps it's as well such a one as Boucher has the Union to see after him. But I'd just like to see the mean as make the Union, and put 'em one by one face to face with Boucher. I reckon if they heard him they'd tell him, if I cotched 'em one by one, he might go back and get what he could for his work, even if it weren't so much as they ordered." Margaret sat utterly silent. How was she ever to go away into comfort and forget that man's voice, with the tone of unutterable agony, telling more by far than his words of what he had to suffer? She took out her purse. She had not much in it of what she could call her own, but what she had she put into Bessie's hand without speaking. "Thank you. There's many on 'em gets no more, and is not so bad off. Leastwise does not show it as he does. But father won't let him want, now he knows. You see Boucher's been pulled down with his childer, and her being so cranky, and they could pawn has gone this last 12-month. You're not to think we ha' letten 'em clem, for all we're a bit pressed ourselves. If neighbours doesn't see after neighbours, I don't know who will." Bessie seemed almost afraid lest Margaret should think they had not the will, and to a certain degree the power of helping one whom she evidently regarded as having a claim upon them. "Besides," she went on, "father is sure and positive the masters must give in within these next few days, that they cannot hold on much longer. But I thank you all the same. I thank you for myself as much as for Boucher, for it just makes my heart warm to you more and more. Bessie seemed much quieter today, but fearfully languid and exhausted. As she finished speaking, she looked so faint and weary that Margaret became alarmed. "It's nought," said Bessie. "It's not death yet. I had a fearful night with dreams, or somewhat like dreams, for I war wide awake, and I'm all in a swounding daze to-day. Only yon poor chap made me alive again. No, it's not death yet, but death is not far off. Cover me up, and I may be asleep, if the cough will let me. Good night. Good afternoon. M'appen, I should say, but the light is dim and misty to-day." End of chapter 19, recorded by Gemma Blythe.
Chapter 20 of North and South. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Leanne Howlett. North and South by Elizabeth Cleghorn Gaskell. Chapter 20. Men and Gentlemen. Old and young, boy, let 'em all eat, I have it. Let 'em have 10 tire of teeth apiece, I care not. Rollo, Duke of Normandy. Margaret went home so painfully occupied with what she had heard and seen that she hardly knew how to rouse herself up to the duties which awaited her. The necessity for keeping up a constant flow of cheerful conversation for her mother, who, now that she was unable to go out, always looked to Margaret's return from the shortest walk as bringing in some news. "And can your factory friend come on Thursday to see you dressed?" "She was so ill I never thought of asking her," said Margaret dolefully. "Dear, everybody is ill now, I think," said Mrs. Hale, with a little of the jealousy which one invalid is apt to feel of another. "But it must be very sad to be ill in one of those little back streets," her kindly nature prevailing and the old Helston habits of thought returning. "It's bad enough here. What could you do for her, Margaret? Mr. Thornton has sent me some of his old port wine since you went out. Would a bottle of that do her good, think you?" "No, mamma. I don't believe they are very poor, at least they don't speak as if they were, and at any rate, Bessie's illness is consumption. She won't want wine. Perhaps I might take her a little preserve made of our dear Helston fruit. No, there's another family to whom I should like to give. Oh, mamma, mamma, how am I to dress up in my finery and go off and away to smart parties after the sorrow I have seen to-day?" exclaimed Margaret, bursting the bounds she had preordained for herself before she came in, and telling her mother of what she had seen and heard at Higgins' cottage. It distressed Mrs. Hale excessively. It made her restlessly irritated till she could do something. She directed Margaret to pack up a basket in the very drawing-room, to be sent there and then to the family, and was almost angry with her for saying that it would not signify if it did not go till morning, as she knew Higgins had provided for their immediate wants, and she herself had left money with Bessie. Mrs. Hale called her unfeeling for saying this, and never gave herself breathing time till the basket was sent out of the house. Then she said, "After all, we may have been doing wrong. It was only the last time Mr. Thornton was here that he said, those were no true friends who helped to prolong the struggle by assisting the turnouts. And this Boucher man was a turnout, was he not?" The question was referred to Mr. Hale by his wife, when he came upstairs, fresh from giving a lesson to Mr. Thornton, which had ended in conversation, as was their wont. Margaret did not care if their gifts had prolonged the strike. She did not think far enough for that, in her present excited state. Mr. Hale listened, and tried to be as calm as a judge. He recalled all that had seemed so clear not half an hour before, as it came out of Mr. Thornton's lips, and then he made an unsatisfactory compromise. His wife and daughter had not only done quite right in this instance, but he did not see for a moment how they could have done otherwise. Nevertheless, as a general rule, it was very true what Mr. Thornton said, that as the strike, if prolonged, must end in the masters bringing hands from a distance, if indeed the final result were not, as it had often been before, the invention of some machine which would diminish the need of hands at all, why, it was clear enough that the kindest thing was to refuse all help which might bolster them up in their folly. But, as to this Boucher, he would go and see him the first thing in the morning, and try and find out what could be done for him. Mr. Hale went the next morning, as he proposed. He did not find Boucher at home, but he had a long talk with his wife, promised to ask for an infirmary order for her, and seeing the plenty provided by Mrs. Hale, and somewhat lavishly used by the children, who were masters downstairs in their father's absence, he came back with a more consoling and cheerful account than Margaret had dared to hope for. Indeed, what she had said the night before had prepared her father for so much worse a state of things that, by a reaction of his imagination, he described all as better than it really was. "But I will go again, and see the man himself," said Mr. Hale. "I hardly know as yet how to compare one of these houses with our Helston cottages. I see furniture here which our labourers would never have thought of buying, and food commonly used which they would consider luxuries. Yet for these very families there seems no other resource, now that their weekly wages are stopped, but the pawn-shop. One had need to learn a different language, and measure by a different standard, up here in Milton." Bessie, too, was rather better this day. Still, she was so weak that she seemed to have entirely forgotten her wish to see Margaret dressed, if indeed that had not been the feverish desire of a half-delirious state. Margaret could not help comparing this strange dressing of hers, to go where she did not care to be, her heart heavy with various anxieties, with the old merry, girlish toilettes that she and Edith had performed scarcely more than a year ago. Her only pleasure now, in decking herself out, was in thinking that her mother would take delight in seeing her dressed. She blushed when Dixon, throwing the drawing-room door open, made an appeal for admiration. "Miss Hale looks well, ma'am, doesn't she? Mrs. Shaw's coral couldn't have come in better. It just gives the right touch of colour, ma'am. Otherwise, Miss Margaret, you would have been too pale." Margaret's black hair was too thick to be plaited. It needed rather to be twisted round and have its fine silkiness compressed into massive coils that encircled her head like a crown, and then were gathered into a large spiral knot behind. She kept its weight together by two large coral pins, like small arrows for length. Her white silk sleeves were looped up with strings of the same material, and on her neck, just below the base of her curved and milk-white throat, there lay heavy coral beads. "Oh, Margaret, how I should like to be going with you to one of the old Barrington assemblies, taking you as Lady Beresford used to take me." Margaret kissed her mother for this little burst of maternal vanity, but she could hardly smile at it, she felt so much out of spirits. "I would rather stay at home with you, much rather, mamma." "Nonsense, darling. Be sure you notice the dinner well. I shall like to hear how they manage these things in Milton, particularly the second course, dear. Look what they have instead of game." Mrs. Hale would have been more interested, she would have been astonished, if she had seen the sumptuousness of the dinner table and its appointments. Margaret, with her London cultivated taste, felt the number of delicacies to be oppressive. One half of the quantity would have been enough, and the effect lighter and more elegant. But it was one of Mrs. Thornton's rigorous laws of hospitality, that of each separate dainty enough should be provided for all the guests to partake if they felt inclined. Careless to abstemiousness in her daily habits, it was part of her pride to set a feast before such of her guests as cared for it. Her son shared this feeling. He had never known, though he might have imagined and had the capability to relish, any kind of society but that which depended on an exchange of superb meals, and even now, though he was denying himself the personal expenditure of an unnecessary sixpence, and had more than once regretted that the invitations for this dinner had been sent out, still, as it was to be, he was glad to see the old magnificence of preparation. Margaret and her father were the first to arrive. Mr. Hale was anxiously punctual to the time specified. There was no one upstairs in the drawing-room but Mrs. Thornton and Fanny. Every cover was taken off, and the apartment blazed forth in yellow silk damask and a brilliantly flowered carpet. Every corner seemed filled up with ornament, until it became a weariness to the eye, and presented a strange contrast to the bald ugliness of the lookout into the great mill yard, where wide folding gates were thrown open for the admission of carriages. The mill loomed high on the left-hand side of the windows, casting a shadow down from its many stories, which darkened the summer evening before its time. "My son was engaged up to the last moment on business. He will be here directly, Mr. Hale. May I beg you to take a seat?" Mr. Hale was standing at one of the windows as Mrs. Thornton spoke. He turned away, saying, "Don't you find such close neighbourhood to the mill rather unpleasant at times?" She drew herself up. "Never. I am not become so fine as to desire to forget the source of my son's wealth and power. Besides, there is not such another factory in Milton. One room alone is 220 square yards. I meant that the smoke and the noise, the constant going out and coming in of the workpeople, might be annoying. I agree with you, Mr. Hale, said Fanny. There is a continual smell of steam and oily machinery, and the noise is perfectly deafening. I have heard noise that was called music far more deafening. The engine room is at the street end of the factory. We hardly hear it except in summer weather when all the windows are open, and as for the continual murmur of the workpeople, it disturbs me no more than the humming of a hive of bees. If I think of it at all, I connect it with my son, and feel how all belongs to him, and that his is the head that directs it. Just now there are no sounds to come from the mill. The hands have been ungrateful enough to turn out, as perhaps you have heard. But the very business, of which I spoke when you entered, had reference to the steps he is going to take to make them learn their place. The expression on her face, always stern, deepened into dark anger as she said this. Nor did it clear away when Mr. Thornton entered the room, for she saw, in an instant, the weight of care and anxiety which he could not shake off, although his guests received from him a greeting that appeared both cheerful and cordial. He shook hands with Margaret. He knew it was the first time their hands had met, though she was perfectly unconscious of the fact. He inquired after Mrs. Hale, and heard Mr. Hale's sanguine, hopeful account, and glancing at Margaret to understand how far she agreed with her father, he saw that no dissenting shadow crossed her face. And as he looked with this intention, he was struck anew with her great beauty. He had never seen her in such dress before, and yet now it appeared as if such elegance of attire was so befitting her noble figure and lofty serenity of countenance, that she ought to go always thus apparelled. She was talking to Fanny, about what he could not hear, but he saw his sister's restless way of continually arranging some part of her gown, her wandering eyes, now glancing here, now there, but without any purpose in her observation, and he contrasted them uneasily with the large, soft eyes that looked forth steadily at one object, as if from out their light beamed some gentle influence of repose, the curving lines of the red lips, just parted in the interest of listening to what her companion said, the head a little bent forwards, so as to make a long sweeping line from the summit, where the light caught on the glossy raven hair, to the smooth ivory tip of the shoulder, the round white arms and taper hands, laid lightly across each other, but perfectly motionless in their pretty attitude. Mr. Thornton sighed as he took in all this with one of his sudden comprehensive glances, and then he turned his back to the young ladies, and threw himself, with an effort, but with all his heart and soul, into a conversation with Mr. Hale. More people came, more and more. Fanny left Margaret's side, and helped her mother to receive her guests. Mr. Thornton felt that in this influx no one was speaking to Margaret, and was restless under this apparent neglect. But he never went near her himself, he did not look at her. Only he knew what she was doing, or not doing, better than he knew the movements of any one else in the room. Margaret was so unconscious of herself, and so much amused by watching other people, that she never thought whether she was left unnoticed or not. Somebody took her down to dinner. She did not catch the name, nor did he seem much inclined to talk to her. There was a very animated conversation going on among the gentlemen. The ladies, for the most part, were silent, employing themselves in taking notes of the dinner and criticizing each other's dresses. Margaret caught the clue to the general conversation, grew interested and listened attentively. Mr. Horsfall, the stranger, whose visit to the town was the original germ of the party, was asking questions relative to the trade and manufactures of the place, and the rest of the gentlemen, all Milton men, were giving him answers and explanations. Some dispute arose, which was warmly contested. It was referred to Mr. Thornton, who had hardly spoken before, but who now gave an opinion, the grounds of which were so clearly stated that even the opponents yielded. Margaret's attention was thus called to her host. His whole manner as master of the house and the entertainer of his friends was so straightforward, yet simple and modest, as to be thoroughly dignified. Margaret thought she had never seen him to so much advantage. When he had come to their house, there had been always something, either of over-eagerness, or of that kind of vexed annoyance which seemed ready to presuppose that he was unjustly judged, and yet felt too proud to try and make himself better understood. But now, among his fellows, there was no uncertainty as to his position. He was regarded by them as a man of great force of character, of power in many ways. There was no need to struggle for their respect. He had it, and he knew it, and the security of this gave a fine grand quietness to his voice and ways, which Margaret had missed before. He was not in the habit of talking to ladies, and what he did say was a little formal. To Margaret herself he hardly spoke at all. She was surprised to think how much she enjoyed this dinner. She knew enough now to understand many local interests, nay, even some of the technical words employed by the eager mill owners. She silently took a very decided part in the question they were discussing. At any rate, they talked in desperate earnest, not in the used-up style that wearied her so in the old London parties. She wondered that with all this dwelling on the manufactures and trade of the place, no allusion was made to the strike then pending. She did not yet know how coolly such things were taken by the masters as having only one possible end. To be sure, the men were cutting their own throats, as they had done many a time before, but if they would be fools, and put themselves into the hands of a rascally set of paid delegates, they must take the consequence. One or two thought Thornton looked out of spirits, and of course he must lose by this turnout. But it was an accident that might happen to themselves any day, and Thornton was as good to manage a strike as anyone, for he was as iron a chap as any in Milton. The hands had mistaken their man in trying that dodge on him, and they chuckled inwardly at the idea of the workmen's discomfiture and defeat, in their attempt to alter one iota of what Thornton had decreed. It was rather dull for Margaret after dinner. She was glad when the gentlemen came, not merely because she caught her father's eye to brighten her sleepiness up, but because she could listen to something larger and grander than the petty interests which the ladies had been talking about. She liked the exultation and the sense of power which these Milton men had. It might be rather rampant in its display, and savour of boasting, but still they seemed to defy the old limits of possibility, and a kind of fine intoxication, caused by the recollection of what had been achieved, and what yet should be. If, in her cooler moments, she might not approve of their spirit in all things, still there was much to admire in their forgetfulness of themselves and the present, in their anticipated triumphs over all inanimate matter at some future time which none of them should live to see. She was rather startled when Mr. Thornton spoke to her, close at her elbow. "I could see you were on our side in our discussion at the dinner, were you not, Miss Hale?" "Certainly, but then I know so little about it. I was surprised, however, to find from what Mr. Horsfall said, that there were others who thought in so diametrically opposite a manner as the Mr. Morrison he spoke about. He cannot be a gentleman, is he?" "I am not quite the person to decide on another's gentlemanliness, Miss Hale. I mean, I don't quite understand your application of the word. But I should say that this Morrison is no true man. I don't know who he is. I merely judge him from Mr. Horsfall's account." "I suspect my gentleman includes your true man." "And a great deal more, you would imply. I differ from you. A man is to me a higher and a completer being than a gentleman." "What do you mean?" asked Margaret. "We must understand the words differently." "I take it that gentleman is a term that only describes a person in his relation to others. But when we speak of him as a man, we consider him not merely with regard to his fellow men, but in relation to himself, to life, to time, to eternity. A castaway, lonely as Robinson Crusoe, a prisoner immured in a dungeon for life, nay, even a saint in Patmos, has his endurance, his strength, his faith, best described by being spoken of as a man. I am rather weary of this word gentlemanly, which seems to me to be often inappropriately used, and often, too, with such exaggerated distortion of meaning, while the full simplicity of the noun man, and the adjective manly, are unacknowledged, that I am induced to class it with the cant of the day." Margaret thought a moment, but before she could speak her slow conviction he was called away by some of the eager manufacturers, whose speeches she could not hear, though she could guess at their import by the short clear answers Mr. Thornton gave, which came steady and firm as the boom of a distant minute gun. They were evidently talking of the turnout, and suggesting what course had best be pursued. She heard Mr. Thornton say, "That has been done." Then came a hurried murmur in which two or three joined. "All those arrangements have been made." Some doubts were implied, some difficulties named by Mr. Slickson, who took hold of Mr. Thornton's arm, the better to impress his words. Mr. Thornton moved slightly away, lifted his eyebrows a very little, and then replied, "I take the risk. You need not join in it unless you choose." Still some more fears were urged. "I'm not afraid of anything so dastardly as incendiarism. We are open enemies, and I can protect myself from any violence that I apprehend. And I will assuredly protect all others who come to me for work. They know my determination by this time as well and as fully as you do." Mr. Horsfall took him a little on one side, as Margaret conjectured, to ask him some other question about the strike, but in truth it was to inquire who she herself was, so quiet, so stately, and so beautiful. "A Milton lady?" asked he, as the name was given. "No, from the south of England, Hampshire, I believe," was the cold, indifferent answer. Mrs. Slickson was catechizing Fanny on the same subject. "Who is that fine, distinguished-looking girl? A sister of Mr. Horsfall's?" "Oh dear no. That is Mr. Hale, her father, talking now to Mr. Stevens. He gives lessons, that is to say, he reads with young men. My brother John goes to him twice a week, and so he begged mamma to ask them here, in hopes of getting him known. I believe we have some of their prospectuses, if you would like to have one." "Mr. Thornton? Does he really find time to read with a tutor, in the midst of all his business, and this abominable strike in hand as well?" Fanny was not sure, from Mr. Slickson's manner, whether she ought to be proud or ashamed of her brother's conduct; and like all people who try and take other people's "ought" for the rule of their feelings, she was inclined to blush for any singularity of action. Her shame was interrupted by the dispersion of the guests. Chapter 20. Recorded by Leanne Howlett.